State Circle is made by MPT to serve all of our diverse communities and is made possible by the generous support of our members. Thank you.
Connecting Marylanders to their government. This is State Circle.
Good evening. Welcome to State Circle. Coming up tonight, Governor Hogan moves ahead on reopening the state, but gets pushback from a top medical advisor. And in our political roundtable, we'll look at the results of the primary election. But first tonight, protests continued this week following the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Washington, D.C. police have planned street closures in the district to accommodate protesters this weekend. The Baltimore County government is increasing police training and updating its use of force policy. And Governor Hogan, in a national interview, called the movement to defund the police a terrible idea. Our newsmaker this week is Erica Bridgeford, who's co-founder of Baltimore Ceasefire. Erica, nice to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to ask, number one, how are you doing? How's your community doing?
I am struggling. My heart is broken. I'm triggered a lot. My son was surrounded by 4 police officers at gunpoint in February of 2019. And so all of these conversations and the murder of George Floyd has triggered a lot of our own pain in my family. And at the same time, I'm really inspired and motivated. In times when the world erupts and people feel hopeless, I tend to focus on what I am able to do. And so I've been extremely busy. I got busier when outside closed than I was before, and definitely during all of the beautiful uprisings around the country. Here in Baltimore, I've been really busy.
You have a long background as a change agent, an activist. When you've been on the streets as part of this, when you're looking at what's happening nationally, how do you see that movement? I mean, are they collectively doing the right stuff, having the impact that they want to have?
Yeah, so what inspires me about it is that literally people around the world are having conversation about how valuable Black lives are in places that I don't think we expect. And so it means, there are conversations about taking down Confederate symbolism, and, there's just so much stuff happening. And I think that's beautiful and inspiring. I really hope, though, that people don't just do it right now because it's the thing to do. And, oppression doesn't calm down for people who are oppressed. It's not in the news as often the way it is right now, but it's still our reality every single day. And so I hope that when there are no more signs to make and there are no more marches and no more protests, that people will really stay engaged and involved in healing social injustices in their communities.
Through everything this year, the coronavirus shutdown, unfortunately, the homicide rate in Baltimore, I don't think has changed much. I think it's
not a lot, no.
40 homicides in the last 30 days. When's the next ceasefire? What's your focus now?
So the next ceasefire weekend, the ceasefire weekends are always February, May, August, and November. They are generally the first full Friday through Sunday of those months, except in May, it's the Friday through Sunday of Mother's Day weekend to honor parents who've lost their children to violence. We do sacred space rituals all year round. So just today, like all morning, I've spent putting 17 sacred space rituals in our calendar for people who were taken by violence from May 31st till June 11th. 17 people were killed just during that time. And so that is a way that we respond to violence. That is a way that we show up, no matter if it was police violence or community violence. We think every life that is taken matters, and the spaces where people are murdered should be sacred ground. So we show up to honor them just like someone showed up to kill them.
What's your relationship with the Baltimore police like? You mentioned your son's incident. obviously scary.
Yeah.
You know, how are they doing compared to the rest of the world?
So the incident with my son was Baltimore County Police. I personally have a very complicated and nuanced relationship with Baltimore City Police because in my work, I work with police officers. I train them in conflict management. We do youth police dialogues where we bring youth and police officers together to have really hard conversations. During ceasefire weekends, when TJ Smith was the spokesperson for BPD, he made sure that we always found out first before the media when someone is killed during ceasefire weekends. And after he left, I was able to keep that connection. And so that part of the police department is very helpful. Police officers in general, when they see us in the streets, blessing murder spaces or whatever, they don't even say a word. They just come and hold space and block off streets for us and that sort of thing. At the same time, you know, I'm very aware that just the structure of policing is very biased and oppressive. And so even within that structure, good officers have a hard time figuring out how to navigate right and wrong a lot of times, I think. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. Our local police department still is extremely unorganized. It's very hard to really build strong partnerships when you're trying to do work with the police department because of so much dysfunction. And so there's still a lot of work to do.
Erica, before we go, where can people find you online if they want to get involved?
So BaltimoreCeasefire.com is our website, and we try to be easy to find everywhere. So we're Baltimore Ceasefire 365 on Facebook, at Baltimore Ceasefire on Instagram, Be More Ceasefire on Twitter, and the next ceasefire weekend is the first Friday through Sunday in August. It is our 3-year anniversary.
Just amazing. A lot of good work in that time. Erica Bridgeford, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Members of Maryland's Legislative Black Caucus held a unique town hall on YouTube this week. Our Charles Robinson was watching.
From the streets of Baltimore to Lafayette Square, just outside the White House, America is speaking in a way we have never heard. It's affecting everyone. Spoke with Delegate Darrell Barnes, who's the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus. Tell me the why and the how of this.
Well, I think it's important that we have a very frank and sometimes unapologetic conversation when they're centered around race relations. And looking at the turmoil that we see around the country right now, the Maryland Legislative Black Caucus felt it important enough to have this conversation with other community leaders and other elected officials around the state.
It's a time that we take a look at the law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights, which means that you can't question a law enforcement officer if they've been accused of a crime for 72 hours.
The event was called Being Black in America in 2020. The conversation was raw and candid.
Why does the law enforcement, the police department, want us to go give them information and, like they call, snitch on our people, when it's been proven time and time again that cops won't tell or snitch on each other for the better good of the community? How do you address that?
This movement has been created in 50 states in 18 different countries. And I think it's high time that folks now see how important Black lives do matter. And if you start looking at where we are today and where we came from, every movement always starts with our young people. And I think our young people are now starting to understand what it means to have their voices heard.
In Owings Mills, I'm Charles Robinson for State Circle.
And State Circle continues right after this.
Can you tell us what you know?
Turning back now to the race for the White House.
The State Board of Elections voted Thursday to set up a new election.
It must be a very emotional day.
The world changed in the blink of an eye. children are at the heart of this story.
A legislative hearing next week will look at a number of complaints over the mailing and counting of ballots in the state's first vote-by-mail election. As of midday on Friday, in the Democratic primary for mayor of Baltimore, Brandon Scott was holding a 2,000-vote lead over former Mayor Sheila Dixon. Joining us for the political roundtable this week are John Bullock, a Baltimore City Council member who just won his primary and has no general election opponent. Also joining us is John Deedy, a CCBC political science professor. Note that Mr. Bullock is also a political science professor. Thank you for being with us. I'll start with Mr. Bullock with your elected official hat on. And first, congratulations. Second, there's going to be a lot of turnover in City Hall. Were voters sending a message? What did you hear from voters when you were out campaigning?
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, and I appreciate the congratulations. Yes, there is turnover going to be at City Hall. Again, we're looking at a new mayor, a new council president, a new comptroller, and 5 new members of the city council. Our time for campaigning and canvassing was cut short, obviously, due to COVID-19. But I will say that as we got into March, some of the things we were hearing was that there were some issues of distrust. There were some desires for change in leadership. And you definitely saw that. So again, we had an incumbent mayor who was dealing with a crisis, but at the same time, there were folks who were looking for new ideas, and it came to a very close race between a previous mayor and a current city council president. On the side of the comptroller was very interesting because you had an incumbent who had been there for over 20 some odd years, who had now been replaced by a long-term council member who talked also about accountability. And then in the council president's race, you had a very spirited competition for an open seat with 2 current members of the council, a current state delegate, who was then able to pull out a victory in that.
Mr. Deedy, your perspective, what were the voters saying?
I think the voters were saying an expression I've heard a lot of times: a new broom sweeps clean. And I think that people saw the leadership that was currently there as rather stagnant. They had been around for a while, but they weren't seeing a lot of results. And I think people wanted some sort of change, and going for someone like Brandon Scott, who's much younger than a lot of the candidates, I really think benefited him. And I think people are looking for Baltimore to move forward.
So, Mr. Deedy, we're going to have a 36-year-old mayor, and finishing up your first term on the council, you're going to be one of the senior people.
That's rather interesting because Brandon Scott has been in office for about 10 years. So he does know what's going on. And I think the other aspect, when you think about Brandon Scott and his experiences, when he ran for office, he made one thing very clear: I'm running to take power away from the mayor's office. And I think that resonated with a lot of people because people always associate elected leaders like they're looking to enhance their power and to do more stuff with their power. But he's actually trying to take some power away. And I think that was rather appealing to voters. I think that voters, I think the thing that helped him a lot was the weekend before the primary, when there was a lot of people out in the streets protesting. He wasn't home. He was out in the streets talking to people. And I think that resonated with a lot of people. He wasn't in a bunker. He was out there.
Yeah, I think you make a lot of good points. One thing I am, pretty excited about serving with a Mayor Scott and a Comptroller Henry and a City Council President Mosby. Again, you see this leadership change. But back in 2016, when I was first elected, there were 8 new council members who came in, and that was a majority of the council. And now going to the second term, having 5 new members is going to be really interesting. So we started looking at, at things in terms of, as you mentioned, the Board of Estimates. And so you have an incoming mayor who has talked about trying to reduce the mayor's power there and thinking about what those 3 individuals do in terms of the Board of Estimates. But then also as it relates to the City Council, what it means in terms of, who's leading committees, what type of leadership is coming forth. And again, thinking about the time period that we're in. You mentioned, what was happening in the weekend prior to the election, and what's happening now as it relates to issues of policing, but also about transparency and the priorities of the city budget. So it's going to be a very interesting time moving forward in this juncture.
Let's spend just a minute on the election process. We had a mail-in vote for the most part because of the coronavirus. We had long lines of people waiting to vote at the polling places that were open. The assumption has always been that mail-in voting will increase turnout. Increased turnout is good for Democrats, not really an issue in Baltimore City. What do you take away from what happened in terms of the process?
It was really interesting. I mean, on the candidate side, again, everything that we've done before is out the window. So again, if we're talking about knocking on doors late in the election, if we're talking about even what the strategy is moving on to election day, it's a challenge. But also it meant that candidates had to make sure that they had a strong effort as it related to things like phone banking and mail and contacting voters through social media. And the successful campaigns were the ones that were able to do it. Now, thinking about turnout, it was actually very encouraging that we had such a high rate of turnout. Some of us were concerned in terms of what it would be like, but it's also encouraging to see a number of first-time voters. The fact that so many ballots were sent out, so many first-time voters or voters who weren't engaged previously had participated. This bodes well for the future.
Mr. Dede?
When I think about this, I think we need to talk about an important aspect. It was great that turnout was up. But the fact that Linda Lamone and Armstead Jones really messed this thing up, that's one way to describe it. This was a cluster disaster. The fact that Mr. Jones was asleep at home on election night is appalling. And I really think that instead of having a fancy investigation, I think some of the leaders in Baltimore, such as Bill Ferguson, who represents District 1, where there are a lot of problems, they need to do more. They need to basically remove Linda Lamone from her position. And they also need to do something to fix the election system, because this is democracy at stake. People have to trust the system. And if they feel like it takes a week for election ballots to be counted, it creates distrust. And this is something that Vladimir Putin has been very good at. And we don't want to have this type of situation where people become more cynical in the process, don't choose to get involved because they believe, oh yeah, they kept counting the ballots and they stopped when Brandon had the lead. I think this is a very important thing, and I think the state really needs to look into doing something about this.
We do need to move on here, but I'll just point out I'm really glad that there's paper, there's an audit trail, an old-fashioned audit trail for this stuff. We should talk about the protests over the police killing of George Floyd. If there's any good news in Baltimore, it's that the protests were not really violent, and I wonder if that's because maybe Baltimore, Mr. Bullock first, is ahead of the curve for unfortunate reasons, but for the last several years has been aggressively reforming the police.
Exactly. Unfortunately, our city went through a very trying time 5 years ago, but there were a lot of lessons learned out of that experience. And so, again, we've dealt with our challenges here on the local level and as it relates to communities and policing and trying to rebuild trust, and then also things like the consent decree. But yes, you saw also that even when there were attempts from those who were not from Baltimore to try to make it into a violent situation, that there were calmer heads here in Baltimore having been through this before. And so, again, I think we're in many ways a model to the rest of the nation, because you look at New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., look at all along Eastern Seaboard, other places that this vitriol is now spiked into violence. And so, unfortunately, we've had our challenges in Baltimore, but it's one thing that we're able to lead on. And again, I think that the opportunity is ahead of us to have these conversations as it relates to policing, what that looks like in communities, and then rebuilding trust.
Mr. Dede, I want to get you in on that, but I'll also point out that the other obvious thing when you just looked at the footage of the protests was it was a diverse group. It was a really diverse group. What does that say to you?
So when you say diversity, I look at diversity not only in terms of race, but also age. So you had young people who were, leading some of these efforts, which was truly inspiring. And it really says a lot about this future generation, because now it was very much multiracial. And in some of these instances, there were less people of color and other folks who are now allies who are coming out. And again, it was something that really speaks volumes, not only to what's happening in Baltimore, but what's happening nationwide. So again, this is something that is very encouraging. I will say one challenge, thinking about where we are health-wise, is looking at COVID-19 and if this results in any spikes. So it's another thing to be thinking about in terms of the lack of social distancing with some of the protests.
Mr. Dede?
Yeah, when I look at it, I was very impressed with the fact that at least during a lot of the protests, people were wearing masks and doing the best they could. I think the diversity of the protest was very positive. I think it also did one other thing. It's re-energized, and I'll explain that, the Black Lives Matters movement, as far as now people understand it better than they did 5 years ago. And I think the fact that you saw video that's there forever of this man being murdered with the choke that was placed on him on his neck, I think it made people think twice about a lot of things. And I think it made a lot of people in suburban communities, people like me, look at that video and also say, that could have been me. And I really think it's going to make people re-examine police departments across the country, get better into community policing. We want to be able to trust our police department, and videos like this don't help.
I'm out of time, but Mr. Bullock, do you know if chokeholds are illegal for the local police?
I mean, it definitely should be. Now, one of the things to think about in terms of as Baltimore is that we also have a city police force that's also controlled by the state. So there are some limitations in terms of what we at the local level can do, but it's something we need to be looking at. But again, we've seen this throughout the nation, and hopefully we're having legislation from a national level that really pushes down on this. And I'd be remiss to say that, again, representing West Baltimore, we've had our share of incidents, and this is something that we need to be thinking about.
Our thanks to Councilman and Professor Bullock and Professor Dede. Gentlemen, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Hundreds turned out in Annapolis Wednesday to honor George Floyd on the day he was buried. Our Sue Copen reports the starting point in Annapolis has important historic ties.
This is the Kunta Kinte Alex Haley Memorial at the City Dock in Annapolis. It's where Haley writes in his book Roots that Kunta Kinte arrived in America and was sold into slavery. In fact, Annapolis was a major center of the Atlantic slave trade. This is also the site where young and old gathered this week to begin a march and protest to honor police victim George Floyd on the day he was laid to rest.
Right now in 2020, what you have is the boiling point, and it is very symbolic that we are starting here at the Kunta Kinte Memorial on the funeral of George Floyd. I think it brings it all full circle, that even though we aren't enslaved, even though segregation isn't alive today, we still have a lot of struggles and we still have a ton of work to do.
Gerald Roysters attended a number of protests following George Floyd's death. He says today's Black Lives Matter movement is part of that awakening.
As a kid, when I was younger, it seemed something so far away, slavery being so far away, but as a man, as a black man in America, I see that some of those same fears, some of the same issues that we have are very much alive.
Victoria Dillman, who made the trip to Annapolis from Harford County to take part in the protest, says she's not familiar with Annapolis's historic connection to slavery, but looks forward to learning about it.
Unfortunately, this was not part of the Maryland history that I was taught. So it's very disappointing. It's not surprising, but it's disappointing. And hopefully that will be one of the things that changes as we continue to speak up about the injustices occurring in our country.
Also adding her voice to the call for change, Arundel County resident Kristin Bloom.
I was working with a client who has autism, he's nonverbal, he's African American, and I had to call the police about something, and I was terrified for his safety. And everything worked out fine, but in that terror I realized there's a real problem.
And change is also what longtime activist the Reverend Annie Chambers urged the crowd gathered under the dome of the State House to fight for.
You're all at the beginning of the revolution! You can't get on your knees! No, don't take a knee! Stand up! Stand up! Stand up! Let's fight back!
Or perhaps, as Alex Haley wrote in Roots, things don't get better unless you make them better. In Annapolis, Sue Copen for State Circle.
The impact of the coronavirus in Maryland continues to fade, with hospitalizations falling by more than 100 over 2 days. Still, 23 people died of the disease in just the last 24 hours. Governor Hogan urged caution, but decided to allow malls, casinos, and other businesses to reopen, along with allowing indoor dining at restaurants.
As we take these additional steps to safely reopen our economy and put more people to work, we want to continue to strongly stress the need to follow CDC and state and local health department requirements and guidelines. The fight against this virus is far from over. In fact, now more than ever, as we begin to come in contact with more people, we must all continue to remain vigilant. Our health and economic recovery depends on all of us continuing to exercise personal responsibility in order to keep ourselves, our family members, our neighbors, and our coworkers safe. The Maryland Strong Roadmap to Recovery plan is based on a flexible, community-based approach. And while we are very encouraged by the metrics that we have achieved in every single one of Maryland's 24 jurisdictions, we are continuing to give local leaders the flexibility that they have requested.
One of the governor's top health experts did express reservations, saying that the pace of reopening could lead to an increase in new cases. Official information and data can be found at coronavirus.maryland.gov. Monday at 7 on Direct Connection, Brandon Scott just won the all-important Democratic primary for mayor of Baltimore. He answers your questions live at 7 Monday on MPT. Now, for all of us at MPT, thanks for watching State Circle, and have a good night.
This program was made by MPT to serve all of our diverse communities.
Hello, I'm Robert Mushaw, Chief Investment Officer of Van Sant Mushaw, a fee-only wealth management firm acting as a fiduciary for families, trust, and qualified plans for over 27 years. Join us in supporting one of Maryland's most valuable assets, Maryland Public Television.
Thank you for the casseroles.
Thanks for the toilet paper.
Thanks for asking how you can help.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias.
From all of us to you, thank you for being part of our movement to love.
Discover an active, vibrant, connected community full of inquisitive individuals who've been learning